This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing stated on it, either by its hosts or any guests, is to be construed as psychological, medical, or legal advice. You're listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. I'm Haley Radke. We are honored to have the brilliant Heijun Wills return to Adoptees On today. We talk about what reunion has looked like in the time since she's published her award-winning memoir, Older Sister, Not Necessarily Related, including the practical how-tos of maintaining a relationship with a family member that lives abroad and speaks a different language. Jenny also addresses what it feels like to be raised with white Eurocentric beauty standards as a person of color. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome back to Adoptees On, Heijun Wills. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, Haley. Thank you so much for having me again.
I am so excited to chat with you again. I was looking back at your last interview with me, which was episode 133. It was in February of 2020. And what innocence we were, because we did not know what was coming. At least I didn't.
No, don't think of it. It feels like maybe a completely different world now, us talking today than back then. Yeah.
Indeed. And you and I even talked about, there was the ASAC conference coming. It was supposed to be in your city in Winnipeg. And I was like, I'm coming. But we did it online instead. But
Yeah. It became so because we ended up postponing the conference for 1 year, and then it made more sense, A, for it to be online, but then B, even if we were considering holding it in person, it wouldn't have been possible for so many people to cross the border. So it was prohibitive, unfortunately, in many ways. Yeah.
It's changed so many things, but you have had your book in the world for over 2 years now, and you shared a lot of your story when you were on in episode 133. So I'm going to direct listeners to go back and listen to that if you haven't heard that episode yet. But for those who haven't, can you share just a little bit of your story so we can kind of get an overview and orient ourselves before we get into some questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So I'm a Korean adoptee. I learned that I was born in Seoul, and I moved to Southern Ontario, Canada, when I was a baby, so midway between toddlership and infancy. And I was raised in a white family in what was at that time a very white community until I moved to Toronto as a teen, I guess, as an adolescent, to go to school. So my background in education originated in journalism, actually. And so I went to school in Toronto, kept going to school, as one sometimes does, that feels a bit directionless in life. And then I met, because of my studies, in fact, which directed me towards Asian American literature, I met a bunch of adoptees when I was an adult, when I was close to 30, in fact. I had moved to Boston to continue with my studies. I met these adoptees and they encouraged me to do a birth search, which I did at that time. And so back in 2008, I made contact with my Korean first mother, and then extended family, siblings, etc., the following year when I returned to Korea for the first time. And our relationship has been sort of dips and doodles here and there, I think. But yeah, I think that I'm in what I would understand to be like a post-reunion state at this point. It's been more than a decade since I reunited with my Korean family. And some of those folks are no longer living. Some of those folks are no longer a part of my life. Different folks are a part of my life. And so it's really revealed to me that these reunions or these experiences are also always alive and always shifting. And it's not fait accompli upon the meeting. It's almost as though that's where everything begins.
I appreciate you sharing that because it's so true. And one of the things in your memoir that I just loved is how, we have these perceptions of reunion that it's like the societal, view that you meet at the airport. Oh my gosh, it's hugs and like it's the moment. But in your memoir, it covers such a long span of time. And then we get to see, for us, it's like these characters in your life really be who they are for better or worse, bad behavior or supportive, all of those things. So, of course, it follows that in real life, these people would move in and out of your life. How has it been since publishing Older Sister, not necessarily related, having it in the world? And then I know there's a language barrier for some of your extended biological family. So have any of them read it? How has that impacted your reunion relationships with various folks to the extent you want to share?
Yeah, first of all, I really appreciate you referring to the figures in the book as characters, because that's what they end up being, right? And that's what they are. And that's even when you're writing nonfiction and memoir, it's still a character. And your speaker is still invented in a certain way, not the things that happen, but the way they represent things. So I really appreciate that nuance and that acknowledgement. I'm not certain how much this memoir has affected the dynamic with my Korean family. To be honest, you're right, there is a language barrier. I hope that one day it's translated into Korean. Maybe that's a bad wish, actually. I take that back entirely. Just kidding. But the one member of my Korean family with whom I'm in contact hasn't read it, but has read some articles in Korea about it, or a book review or something, I'm not sure. But I think that there were other life things that had a greater impact on relationships that were able to be sustained and those that had to be let go temporarily or maybe for longer, I'm not sure. But yeah, I couldn't tell you what the impact is, to be honest, on those folks. In terms of other areas of my life, it creates complications, I think, when one meets new people. It's a really different dynamic, meeting people who know a lot about you and maybe you don't tell you at the beginning, or who meet you and then learn a lot about you. And as you know, I think a lot of people who write in life writing write about things that they don't talk about in their daily lives very often. And so it feels kind of, it can be a little bit complicated. And one knows already how some adopted folks have maybe trust dynamic complications, let's just put it that way, or stress about overexposure or this and that. So it's been interesting and a learning experience. But I feel like I've learned a lot about nonfiction, and I've learned a lot more about how I exist in the world and what my limits are since then.
No one else can see my face, but I think I'm desperate to know more, but I don't think I should poke away at that. Okay.
When you stop the recording, share a bit more.
Yes. Okay. No, I relate so much because I don't really think of myself this way, but this is sort of what's happened as being a podcaster, right? People hear so much of my life, and for some of you, bless you, you listen every week, and I'm your friend that goes on a walk with you, Friday mornings. And so you feel so much more connected to me than I may not know your name, And so I understand that overexposure kind of feeling. So yes, I very much relate. Even in your book, you do mention there was a period of estrangement from your adoptive parents. And I think I have it marked. Look at me go. First, after some distress, my relationship with my Canadian family predictably fractured, but the cracks exposed the places where repair could be made, and we found each other again and tried to move forward. So I think during, after, it's just always in flux, relationships.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell us practically how you have tried to maintain relationships with anyone that is still in Korea? Because I know we have lots of transnationally adopted people listening, and, any advice or how you've done that for the periods of time that it was a thing for you? I'm not sure. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, this really interesting thing has happened in my life in the last year. I have this girlfriend who's Korean Canadian, was raised in, like where I live currently, is second generation, but grew up in a Korean household. And so speaks Korean Canadian, let's just say. And it's been really marvelous because I'm speaking to my older sister in Korea for the first time, in fact, really, because there's someone who cares about me and is close enough to me not to be ashamed to ask certain questions or to say personal things to my sister, and to translate some of those questions between us. And what's been really miraculous about that is that my sister and I both had been afraid that because of some distance we had both intuitively had from our shared sort of parental connection, we thought the other person had taken it personally or was harmed by our trepidation in these ways. But through this relationship and through having someone who can translate, who cares, but doesn't really have sort of, any stake in the adoption industry or anything like that, doesn't really have that much knowledge about adoption to begin with, it's really opened up an opportunity to have those kinds of real communications. Because when I was with my Korean family, especially the first time I was in Korea, it was always through translators that we were able to communicate. And often they would be translators that the agency had assigned, and people who had been raised in Korea, and so wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable because of various sort of, I guess, cultural honorific dynamics to ask extremely personal questions, the sort of dirty, gritty questions that you want to find out about. So it was always a balance of finding out what's too intimate to ask, what's going to be taken with offense or whatnot. But when you're with someone very close to you and you can actually establish like a feeling relationship together through translation, it's really changed things. So I feel optimistic about that relationship. And I think a lot of things have been able to be said that could never have been said through more traditional translator dynamics.
So if I'm understanding you right, you are having your Canadian Korean friend do the translation between you and your older sister who remains in Korea.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. And one more actual practical question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you email back and forth? How are you communicating?
Mostly on Instagram, video chat.
Oh, and so is your Canadian friend with you at the time?
Yeah.
Okay, so you would have a conversation and she would translate.
That's right.
Okay.
And then I'll see my sister and her family or her home. And then my girlfriend's calling my sister on me also, older sister. It's really creating an interesting triangular dynamic of care, I think.
Well, that gives me the warm fuzzies. So
okay. Yeah.
If that's what you were trying to convey, that's what I'm getting.
Good. Phew.
Okay. Well, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some more cultural reclamation topics, if you're okay with that. I know in your professorship, you are an expert at, no, not expert.
Expert at nothing.
Expert at nothing.
But student of many things.
Okay, student of many things. Okay, yeah. She's shaking her head at me. Okay, well, race relations, you look at a variety of topics, but I think you've lived enough time in this world that you know what I mean when I'm talking about cultural reclamation.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a little bit weird, but I read this amazing... Sorry, it's weird because you're going to think I'm going off topic. The book we read for our book club in January was A Team of Their Own by Seth Berkman.
Okay.
And it's about a hockey team in Korea.
Yes.
And there's a whole section in his book where they're talking about some of the players that are adopted from Korea and those things. But there's a section about Korean beauty standards and some of the plastic surgery that's very common and those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And then part 2 of that is I was recently at this conference, and there was a panel with a birth mother speaking about open adoption and a couple of other people on there. And she was a Black birth mother with her 2 Black children who had been adopted into a white family. And she was mentioning to us that she could already tell that her children had accepted white standards of beauty, being raised in a white household.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering your thoughts on that, because even in our last interview, I kind of gushed about your makeup a little bit. And I know, being a makeup artist is really that. Like, you are so artistic and it comes out in your writing, it comes out on your face. But do you have thoughts on what adoption has done to you personally or other adoptees on what their view of beauty culturally is?
Yeah, that's a really provocative question. I teach this seminar that just wrapped up, actually, that's called Race, Fashion, and Beauty, because I think that, and it's not just a course like complaining about like the weird things that white people do. It's a course about celebrating and like resistance and creation and those kinds of things. But everything is coded by systemic as well as personal experiences of race. So of course, we're impacting and impacted by these things when we think about aesthetics, beauty, the way we present ourselves, the ways we choose not to represent ourselves in the world. I published this piece. It was a creative nonfiction essay in this magazine, I think maybe a year ago or 2 years ago, about beauty and Korean adoption, actually. And in it, I was thinking a lot. It's sort of scattered, so it's a little bit like my memoir, but a shorter version. And it goes through various sort of moments where I've been thinking about aesthetics and appearance and race and adoption. And one of the moments that I talk about in that essay that really has stayed with me is I was asked to speak at a culture camp once. And of course, there was a typical sort of refusal and gaslighting from certain parents, like in the actual presentation that I gave. However, what was interesting to me afterwards is that there were some youths who were there, so adolescent youths, and they came to me afterwards and they were like, can you teach us how to do eyeliner on our eyes or how to put on mascara? And it was a really touching moment, but also a very sad moment. And their like white mothers also asked me like how to help them in those ways, which of course I was happy to discuss, because to me, I feel that can be a way to bond or like make connections or like feel good about oneself. But I also remember that there was a young person there, and I also write about this in the essay. And I said, oh, you're so beautiful, like you're so cute or whatever. And then her mother was like very resistant to that. And she said, well, she's very smart, but she didn't want her to be acknowledged for her appearance. And in the essay, I think I wrote something along the lines of, and maybe it's very shady and aggressive, I don't know. But they're like things that adoptive parents like can't take credit for, or like they don't want our mothers to have given to us. They want to like refuse these things. And I'm not saying that aesthetics are like solely a biological thing. I realize that there are a lot of factors, environmental factors that go into these things as well. But it made me feel so upset and distraught because I think I remember being a young person and wanting someone to say like, you're so cute, you're so attractive, without it being attached to like for a Korean, or like we need this diversity representation here or whatever. It just made me a bit sad, that moment. So yeah, I think that these things are all sort of woven together, that we definitely are impacted by Eurocentric standards of beauty. It's made even more exacerbated when I think we're raised in families and contexts where at the very least, people of color aren't being discussed as beautiful in the household as well, if that makes sense.
I gotta find that article you wrote.
Oh, it's called A Certain Swanness, because my friend, she's so cute. She's a Chinese Canadian writer. She said, she always says I have like a swan-like quality. And I don't know if she means like the swans in Stratford, Ontario. They're like gonna get ya. That you should not be like giving any breadcrumbs to. They will like take your eyes out and like they will get you. No, she means, I think, like my posture, maybe, I don't know. But I named it that because also one of the blurbers for my memoir was like, oh, it's like the ugly duckling syndrome. And then she became a swan. I was like, okay, no one's talking about ugly duckling. How dare you? But it sort of resonates, I think, with your question about when your like egg is rolled over to the maybe not incorrect nest, but like maybe a different nest, let's just say, how one can feel underappreciated in some ways.
Absolutely.
And then when you fly back to your proper nest, the swans fly. I don't know. I'm really revealing myself. I need to do more research on my metaphors.
No, I think when I was listening to that mother talk about her children, and then she mentioned this thing about her daughter having a crush on a white boy,
Right.
and how that's what she was just naturally attracted to now because of, I mean, she attributed it to the time her daughter has spent in this white household.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh my gosh, I never thought of that before. Again, because that's not my experience. And so it's just another fascinating layer to adoption. Thank you so much, adoption.
No, I totally would believe that. Yeah, I totally believe that. So I was thinking the other day, I'm a huge baseball fan. Like, it's surprising, first of all, to people, but also it's frightening because I'm like really intense about it. And I was thinking that when I was a youth, because my family also likes baseball, it was like the only safe way for me to like look at and appreciate and like kind of have a crush on people of color. In those ways, it felt like at the time, because of, you know, the post-racial like weirdness of my family or whatever, a safe way to have attraction to people of color in those ways. So yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking about that because baseball started again and I'm like getting excited.
Well, that is very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
It's weird, right?
Well, you know, even I asked you permission to ask you about those things before we recorded, because there's another layer to this, and you're an editor on this very dense but fascinating book. So I'll just say it. It's academic, okay? So it's dense. That is accurate.
It's no good. I know.
Adoption and Multiculturalism, Europe, the Americas, and the Pacific. And so you're one of the editors on that. And one of the essays I found extremely fascinating was Kimberly McKee's From Adoptee to Trespasser, the Female Asian Adoptee as Oriental Fantasy. Mm-hmm. And she takes us through this whole fascinating look at, well, let's just say it, at we're looking at Mia Farrow, Woody Allen, the adopted daughter who, it's very messy. And she does this whole unpacking of that. So even as we're talking about beauty standards and what the world sees and looking at adoptees from a different perspective, then I'm just going to recommend that essay right now because, wow. Did you have any thoughts on that? Did you work on that piece at all with editing the book?
Yeah, so I was, so there are two other co-editors for this collection, Indigo Willing, who's from Australia, and Tobias Hübinette, who's from Sweden, I believe. And we sort of divided sort of the pieces. And so I was working with Kim on that piece. And I know what she's working on now and what she's worked on in the past. And it's very exciting stuff. It's so devastating the ways that adoptees of color, I think, have been and continue to be fetishized from infancy or from concept, from, before they even exist. They're mythologized in a certain way, I think, through to adulthood. And so Kim's talking about particularly Korean women, girls to women in this case. And with that, of course, comes the Orientalist fetishizing narrative of cuteness to sexual availability that is part of a colonial narrative. And that's, what instigated overseas adoption, I think, from the beginning. So it's like this strange, self-fulfilling machine of fetishization that, of course, in the examples that Kim's looking at with Woody Allen and Mia Farrow, culminates in its most, I think, perverse and distressing, or a version of a perverse and distressing expression. But this is always part of this dynamic, I think, from cuteness to exoticness or whatnot is part of it. I think often of Anne Lang Chang's book called Ornamentalism, and how for the yellow woman, she's always an ornament. It's about becoming a woman after being this sort of object, this hard object that can be contained because of the way that she's imagined in these ways. So if you add adoption on top of it, beyond the fact that to desire and to adopt brings with it certain kinds of, I think, elements of fetishization, perhaps, there's also the fact that, at least from my perspective, I had no idea that these narratives existed about Asian women in the world. And so when you grow into a certain age, you haven't had those important talks with older siblings or parents or aunties or grandmothers. And you haven't, even if it's not a sit down talk, you haven't witnessed how your older siblings and aunties or relatives have been treated in the world. So you also don't have an experiential toolkit on how to deal with Orientalism and fetishization and all of those things.
I appreciate you saying that. And I mean, what about this 360 look, right? Going from, do I even see myself as beautiful because I'm raised in a white family, which is not acknowledging my beauty, to how the world sees me and the toxicity of that and all the things that it perpetuates. I don't know. I don't know what Kim's working on. I don't know what you're working on, but I can't wait for y'all to be writing those books too.
Same. I can't wait. But what you say is what's so important is that juxtaposition that happens at a certain point in one's life, because it becomes the potential ignition for something so problematic and upsetting and worrying, I think. Yeah, I have something coming out soonish, I think, that's about the 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 sexual dangers that present themselves, I think, when in circumstances when we aren't made prepared and when we are sort of like left to the wolves in a certain way.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to learning more about that from you. And yeah, it's not talked about that much, I don't think. So thank you. The other question I wanted to ask you about in relation to the Adoption and Multiculturalism book is, I mean, it's sort of from this overall perspective. So maybe could you talk about what led you and your co-editors to put this collection together?
Mm-hmm.
And in that, I think you will explain sort of the piece that I am also causing this issue, because we're perpetuating mostly the view of the adoptees' experience in Western nations. Because, I mean, I'm in Canada. Most of my listeners are American. A lot of my guests are American. You're in Canada too, fellow Canadian.
Yes, but that's terrible. We shouldn't celebrate nationalism.
Oh yeah.
Yes,
Sorry. No,
I'm just teasing.
We are Canadian. Just an acknowledgement. Yes. Okay.
Yes. In what is today known as Canada.
Thank you.
Yes. I'm just playing with you. Yeah.
No, it's true. And the other, yes, I have another question for you about that as being an ally. But yeah, could you just mention a little bit about that? And in the context of what should we be paying attention to in our own bias as, for me, being an adoptee in the circumstances I have where I am?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And I haven't really spoken about this collection to anyone. So if my answers seem a bit meandering, it's because I'm not sort of thinking about it in this way. But when I approached Tobias and Indigo many, many years ago, I think it was 2013 or 2014, I said, I think we should try to work on an anthology that is interested in how transnational adoption is functioning in other countries beyond the United States. Because what I had been reading in my studies or in my work had mostly been centering the US. And yes, of course, in terms of sheer numbers and demographics, that absolutely makes sense. I'm not trying to be shady or anything like that. But the reality is, in many sort of adoptive lands that practice transnational adoption, we're existing in different political circumstances, in different cultural circumstances. And that was what was the entry point into this conversation. It shifted, or it narrowed itself to the theme of multiculturalism, because the more we talked, the more we realized that there were different understandings, first of all, of what multiculturalism meant, if that was even a part of whatever national narrative the authors were sort of looking at. And, and the contradictions between multiculturalism and or interculturalism, if you live in certain places, was fascinating, because so much of this transnational adoption narrative is connected to this idea of immigration, multiculturalism, and or xenophobia and assimilation, et cetera. And so that's what initiated that project. And while certainly there are a number of American scholars working on US-based stuff, I was really excited to have scholars from other so-called like Western or like global North nations that practice transnational adoption contributing, because I learned so much from these folks just asking, like, what does multiculturalism mean in the country in which you're studying? Usually the people were from those nations themselves. What does it mean? And how does it impact transnational adoption? Because it's very different. And the chapter that I co-wrote was focused on Quebec, which, for those folks who are unfamiliar with the dynamics between Quebec and maybe the rest of Canada, is also a really unique and complicated thing. But aside from a couple of folks, the only transnational adoptees I've ever met in Canada were raised in Quebec. So it adds like another layer, being a linguistic minority in this nation, but then like linguistic majority as a francophone in Quebec. What countries are Quebecois folks adopting from? How come? And how language and culture circulates in that very unique place.
I mean, it's so brilliant that you were able to gather together all of these different authors. And as I was reading, I'm not finished it all yet. I told you, it's dense. You know what?
It is. I know.
It's a slow going. But I'm really wanting to take it all in. And I have learned so much about different countries' perspectives, and therefore their adoptees who have been adopted into those countries, their experience. So it's just like one other way to expand our minds around the adoptee experience in a very global way. So I really am enjoying reading it. I'm learning a lot. I'm learning a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, I know our time is wrapping up. I just wanted to give you credit for something that I still am thinking about this. I know you probably don't even remember it because it probably was so normal and insignificant to you. But for me, no. I saw you being an ally in action. It just happened at just an online event that both of us happened to be in. There was like a breakout room, and there was a person that on their way out of the room said some really sexist, misogynistic things that were, kind of meant in a joking kind of way. They were, I'm sure people can kind of imagine sort of the stereotypes kind of thing that someone like that.
I vaguely remember there was like some gender essentialist or like turfy nonsense,
yes.
I think.
Yes.
I'm remembering. Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I remember being so uncomfortable in the moment. I kind of was laughing. I'm like, oh my gosh, is this guy for serious? Anyway, so he left before anybody could say anything. And as soon as he was gone, you right away jumped in and were like, is everybody okay? I'm really sorry you had to experience that. And you kind of acknowledged any of those things that sort of needed repair. And I've thought about that to this day on multiple occasions. I know. And see, for me, it was really significant because I haven't seen very many people do something like that. So I'm sorry to put you on the spot or embarrass you in that way. But can you talk about that just briefly, about being an ally?
Maybe. No, I appreciate your memory of that moment. I was sort of joking before, like maybe I've repressed this memory because of the goblinry of the person. I'm not sure. But what it sounds like to me is that maybe I went into teacher mode. And I don't mean that in like a condescending way, like everyone else is like my student or something like that. But I think that in my classrooms, at least, because I teach critical race studies and then creative writing, these are both topics that require attentiveness to marginalized, underrepresented experiences. I think one just like clicks into that mode of making sure that those who could be most harmed by something are feeling that they're not, out in left field for feeling something, even if it's not the same feeling that I'm, trying to support someone in feeling. Maybe it's anger or laughter or fear, or there's so many ways that people can take their emotions in these ways. But just to know that people are recognizing it's a feeling moment and that's okay, I guess. I'm not sure. I don't really think about allyship very much, but I try not to harm people, I guess, in the things that I do. That's just how
That's just how you are. So you can't explain it because it's just how you are. And that's I think, something to be like, I look up to you for that.
Oh.
And it's because I've seen you, like, that was like, I was going to say IRL, but it wasn't in real life, but it was, live. But I think you do that in your writing and how you talk about adopted people. And I'm going back to adoption. That was not an adoption example, but very much that you are doing work on behalf of adoptees in a protective kind of manner without doing the we're not all a monolith. So there you go.
That's really nice of you to say. Thank you. I think a lot about my mentors in life, and they always say, just as long as you're not hurting people and that you're taking care of people who might be hurt by things when they want you to take care of them, I guess also.
Also that, yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. So when you were on the show on episode 133, I recommended your memoir, and I'm going to do that again. And because you are joining us in June for our book club, so I'm really excited. So for Patreon supporters of the show, those are the people that are keeping the wheels going on this machine, just so you know. So thank you so much to our supporters.
Amazing people.
I know, aren't they? Adoptees who want to see more adoptee work in the world. So you're going to join us live and talk about your memoir with us. Mm-hmm. But for those people who haven't read it, I'll gush a little bit again. I just reread it, but this time I listened on Audible, and it was such a different experience. And if I had a critique, I am going to give it. It wasn't your voice, and that's okay.
That's right.
I know. You actually told me at one point behind the scenes the circumstances of that. But it's just because I'm such an auditory person, and I know what you sound like. But the reader is wonderful. It is so well done.
She's fabulous.
I really enjoyed that. And I'm not normally like into audiobooks, but I really loved having her read it. And so if you're into audiobooks, maybe you would like to listen. It's lovely that. And it's in paperback now. The cover is so beautiful. Do you want to talk about the new cover?
Thank you. Yeah, it's been in paperback for about a year now. I'm so excited because it's pink. It's the same pink that's on one of the patches of the hardback version. And it was a different designer. It was really interesting, the communications with them, because when they showed me the first version, I was like, okay, it looks too red. And with like the scribbled font in yellow, I believe, right? Or maybe that's how it originally was. I was like, it looks too much like Viet, the sympathizer. Like, we cannot do that. And they were like, oh, okay. So then they switched the font color. It's still that sort of cursive printing look kind of thing. And we fiddled with the pinks back and forth. Also, my agent weighed in and was like, I don't like this pink and like this and that. But what was also cool was they have a tip-in page, which is, for those who are unfamiliar, it's when there's like a glossy page on the second page and the first page is like folded a little bit shorter. So you can see the second page that has like reviews and blurbs and whatever. And it's an orange, which is a great combo, I think, with hot pink. And there's a faded persimmon in the background on that. And they had me on the tip-in page, instead of having the title of the book in English, had me write in my own Korean penmanship, which is abysmal. So I do not recommend anyone look at it. What I had originally named the book, which was Unni. So, which is what older sister, not necessarily related, means in Korean. So I wrote that. And sent that in. And it's very interesting how they do it. They're like, you need to write it with a certain color of Crayola crayon on a thing for it to get that particular aesthetic. Like, it was really cool learning about that stuff.
Oh, yeah. That is amazing. I actually ordered it in paperback to have both copies for when we have book club.
I can just send these to you. Good grief. You're so silly rabbit.
No. Support the work. That's the vibe. So I'm so glad we get to read it with you for a book club. And so, yes, if you want to hear me gush more about why I loved it, you can go back to listen to 133. But what do you want to recommend for us today?
For the past, ever since it was released, I've had to keep my mouth shut for about 6 months before it was released. But ever since, I've been recommending Lisa Bird Wilson's Probably Ruby, which is like a literary fiction novel. It's stunningly written. The characters are like an emotional sucker punch, and it's fiction, but like fiction's awesome. Fiction by an adoptee about adoption. And it's just breathtaking as a book. And I was so pleased to get an early copy of this. And now I've seen the US cover of it. It's so different. And that's also super cool. I love it.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're recommending it. She was just on the show. We talked about it. We got to hear about the art for the Canadian release and the American release.
Cool. Oh my God, I'm so jealous.
Lisa's amazing.
Oh my God, I'm totally fanning out here. Like, I'm so jealous of you.
I hope that we will, I hope we'll choose it next year as one of our book club picks, because I would love to read that with other adoptees.
It's stunning.
Yes.
But also I need to recommend, because I was reminded on social media also recently that for Asian Canadian writers, our foreparent, Wei Sin Choi, who was publishing books in the 90s, he was a queer Chinese Canadian individual, was an adopted person, like an intraracially adopted person. And I, terribly have like always sort of left his writing off of when I'm asked to recommend something. So I am not going to make that error anymore and recommend his memoir, All That Matters, which I believe came out in 2004. And it's about him being middle-aged, or if not more, and learning that he was an adoptee. So he was an intraracial Chinatown adoptee in Canada.
And late discovery.
Absolutely. And I believe it began after like a medical emergency. Like if I'm remembering correctly, I don't want to mischaracterize though. But also the novel for which he's most well known, The Jade Peony, has an adopted character. The second son in that text is also adopted, and it's a Chinatown adoption. These are stories we don't hear about very much. I think intraracial Asian adoptions that are happening because of XYZ. And, Wei Sin Choi, besides being a brilliant writer, was one of the kindest people. And I don't think you can ask an Asian Canadian writer today, I don't think you'd be able to find someone who didn't have a conversation with Wei Sin Choi, him encouraging them to continue writing and them doing it because he was so generous and so kind and so supportive. So if you like Asian Canadian writing today, it's because of this individual, and he was an adoptee.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I had no idea. I absolutely will link to his work. And yeah, it looks like he passed away in 2019.
Yeah, it was a huge loss. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I remember meeting him before I even thought about being a writer. I was an MA student, I think, or an early PhD student. And I met him at a reading, and I told him I was an adoptee. And he said, "Oh, you need to write about this." And there's so many people, not adoptees necessarily, but who have the same experience. So for such an established, well-known writer to always be encouraging people to write, not being, a gatekeeper or jealous or weird or anything like that. Like, it's a really special gift, I think.
Plus the cheerleaders, right? Like,
yes.
Seriously, there's so many adoptees in this space, I feel, that have that attitude and are cheering each other on, cheering our peers on. I think that's amazing. Just like you. You're like that. No. Okay, where can we connect with you online?
I'm on Instagram at Heijun Wills and Twitter at Jenny Heijun.
Perfect. Thank you so much for talking with us. And we're super looking forward to book club with you.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait. And you're so nice to like assign my book.
Yes, I'm assigning homework. I'm not a professor, but we all have homework.
Yes, there's required reading. And I hope like some of these amazing writers that you've assigned are being read and enjoyed thoroughly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then also me.
And also you. You too. Amazing writer.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
So as I shared, Jenny is our book club author for June 2022. If you are listening to this when it is recorded, we invite you to join us for our live discussion with her about Older Sister Not Necessarily Related. You can find out more details about our Adoptees Only Patreon book club if you go to adopteeson.com/book club. We would love to have you join us for our Zoom call with Jenny at the end of June. And if you're not available to join us live, the recording of that will drop shortly after for patrons right into their favorite podcast app. All supporters of the Adoptees On podcast on Patreon get access to our weekly podcast called Adoptees Off Script. And so normally that is me and one of my adoptee friends, often Carrie Cahill Mulligan, talking about adoption things that are happening, and also our book club recordings. So we would love to have you join us for that. And that is the way this show continues in the world. So thank you so much to our supporters for continuing to help Adoptees On live in the world. We are so thankful for you. Adopteeson.com/book club has details for you. And I look forward to chatting with you in book club. Thank you so much for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.